Okay, so I'll be talking about cannabis equity and the preliminary interviews that I've been conducting with program managers across the state. So the objective of these preliminary investigations is to eventually apply for a DCC research grant to find out what equity program elements are actually increasing the number of licensed equity verified businesses. So we hope to surface best practices, trends, and business models, and also show some innovative and effective ways to provide technical support. And bottom line being, let's try to streamline these programs so they can have consistent financial support and continue with their momentum. So the quantitative piece of this will be conducted by this faculty and student collaboration at the Cannabis Studies program at Cal Poly Humboldt. They have developed the Cannabis Studies Lab, which has produced several equity data visualizations so far, pulling information from the DCC's Cannabis Unified License Search tool. And so they'll be covering that. The students have already done a lot of work in this area. And what I'll be doing is gathering quantitative data through the local interviews. And so it was this information, this data is readily available. I was able to get all the local jurisdictions that have received cannabis equity grants listed. And then I went a little bit further to identify the programs and the people who manage these programs. And I've conducted 3 interviews so far with 2 more scheduled. And what I hope to get from these is direct insight from the program managers so we can see what's missing from the digital online data and websites. So here's my primary data source so far, 5 years of grants to counties and cities, and the disbursements from the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. And every time that an allocation comes down from the legislature, the jurisdictions apply for the money and the GoBiz sends them the money, they post a press release where we've gathered this financial data. Can't really see. So some interesting findings from looking at these 2 different kinds of equity grants is that there have been 20 equity assessment grants awarded amongst all of these jurisdictions and 21 equity program grants. So that means 20 equity assessment grants to review the jurisdictions, their communities, and the landscape of participants, and then 21 equity program grants to actually direct money and services to people who are verified equity program participants. And so amongst the equity assessment grants, only 11 of the 20 moved forward with actual programs. So 9 jurisdictions, perhaps wisely, did not move forward with the program. And also notable is that some jurisdictions like Oakland and San Diego did their own internal equity assessments before I think the grants were available. So they moved straight into their own internal assessment and then into an active program. And amongst the active programs, since 2019, we've seen 21 jurisdictions receive funds to direct grants and services to program participants. There's currently about 13 that are actively serving constituents. And in 2024, only 10 received funding. Now, the jurisdictions that have received funding all 5 years are Humboldt, San Francisco, Oakland, and Sacramento. Now, a few jurisdictions, unfortunately, have suspended their services for various reasons. Some spent their money and didn't apply for a grant the following year. Some have not fully spent down their previous year's funds. And there are some barriers due to local policy complications, local regulation crossroads, staffing issues, etc. So some more findings, interesting findings, are that local programs really have to design what they present to their constituents based on regional demographics and culture. So in this design and administration of the programs, some jurisdictions like Humboldt and Sacramento already had internal programs and staff ready to execute. Hi. And some jurisdictions explored third-party contractors, some of which were nonprofit contractors or for-profit contractors. And some jurisdictions relied on like special contractors to provide education services. For example, Long Beach has real estate brokers who advise their participants on how to identify a space, but they don't do the actual brokering. Let's see, also, there's a challenge in actually facilitating the funding directly to the equity participants. So once a jurisdiction gets the money from GoBiz, then they have to find out how to put it into the hands of the equity verified participants. It seems that most programs you do this by absorbing the grantees as vendors in their online supplier portal systems. The city of LA uniquely, I think, is the only one that was able to offer direct deposit of grant funds to their participants. Now, getting a check from a city of LA, city of Oakland, into the hands of somebody who has a bank account that isn't obviously like tied to their cannabis business can be tricky. So I had a client in Oakland who was using a credit union for her banking, and she had a $30K check from the city of Oakland, and the credit union, wouldn't let her deposit it into her account. They said, "Where did you get this money? Why is the city giving you this money?" And she was saying, "Oh, it was like an award, my business is, getting support from the city," and they really pressed her on what it was for. So direct deposit is a blessing for these participants who don't need another hurdle to jump through when trying to receive these funds. And so a clever way to get around this is for the jurisdictions to provide services or like fee waivers and do an interagency transfer. So instead of the money coming from GoBiz directly to the hands of the participants, it stays kind of behind the scenes in where maybe the city administrator's office would transfer funds to their city planning office to cover a fee or some sort of other administrative cost. And so there are funding caveats. When the money comes from GoBiz to the jurisdictions and they're trying to get it to the program participants, there's a disguised financial burden and a 30% tax on these grants. So somebody who's getting, 50K isn't really getting 50K. At the end of the year, they have to pay that 30% tax rate. And if an equity program participant has restrictions on their income level because they're receiving some sort of benefits, disability benefits, or other subsidies, getting this grant could really mess up their taxes. Yeah. Also, the eligible use of funds for equity programs are also restricted. So if somebody paid their rent from their savings 6 months in advance and then got a 50K check from an equity program, they can't reimburse themselves. They can only spend those monies on future purchases. So they could pay it for the next 6 months of their rent or for construction that's going to happen in a month, but they can't reimburse themselves. These are only for future expenses and expenses related to their cannabis business. So they can't pay their own rent. They can't, pay anything personal. They have to use all of the funds for their business. And so some of the challenges are that most of these businesses are in the startup stage and they won't be making revenue anytime soon. So they are putting money into something that's not giving them a return on their investment. And also some jurisdictions, if they're past the startup stage, they allow grantees to purchase inventory cannabis products with these funds, but not every jurisdiction allows that because not every jurisdiction has equity program participants that are out of the startup phase and actually licensed and running their businesses. And another solution that some jurisdictions have introduced to their program is to create a source of internal or local funding so they're not dependent on GoBiz funds. An example of this is in Long Beach, where they charge their general operators an annual fee that feeds back into their equity program. So in addition to these interviews and the data visualizations that will be coming from the student and faculty at Cal Poly Humboldt, over my 5 years, as a technical assistance provider and underwriter for these programs, I've mapped some of these systems. So I've mapped what it looks like when the city staff is charged with executing these programs, not just the equity programs, but all of their cannabis permitting processes. There's also a flow of state funding for the equity programs from the state to GoBiz to the programs to the participants. And a really complex systems map that I made was to see what happens when the grant or loan underwriting process begins. So most people who are in equity programs don't really have an idea of how to create a financial profile for themselves. So there's a lot of handholding that goes through sort of onboarding them and helping them understand how they can use this money. Because it's not just, money in hand. They don't just get a check and they get to do whatever they want with it. They have to go through this rigorous process of submitting their personal information. They have to prove that they can be equity verified, which means they were somehow affected by prohibition in the war on drugs. That could be based on what zip code they live in, what school district they went to, if they had like a criminal misdemeanor. And then they also have to provide often a lot of information about their business. So that could be a business plan. That could be them already paying business taxes in their city. Sometimes they need insurance, even in the startup stage. So putting together all of that sort of baseline paperwork, which we call underwriting, in order to receive these state grants, creates a lot more hurdles for participants to jump through.